The Hearing, a legal podcast from Thomson Reuters.
We had three people on stage. All three of us had been targeted for assassination. Myself, Christoph Grosev, who is being persecuted by Vladimir Putin, and Keelan Gallagher, who has been targeted by the Chinese state. And I can't think that in any recent past you would have had a situation where both journalists and lawyers are being targeted. That is a really upgrading of risk. And, whilst it hasn't slowed me down, I can certainly understand how it would slow a lot of people down in wanting to represent them. And of course, it also means that there are countries you can't go to because of cases that you've taken.
Welcome listeners. I'm really excited today because my guest is someone who needs very little introduction in legal circles. He is Mark Stephens CBE, and Mark works at the London-based law firm Howard Kennedy LLP. He's a renowned solicitor and media law expert, and he's built a formidable reputation defending freedom of expression, human rights and complex international legal cases. He's represented artists, activists, journalists and even heads of state. Mark's known not only for his sharp legal mind, but he's pretty outspoken advocate on key civil liberty issues. So what are we going to talk about today with Mark? We'll be diving into some of those high profile cases and also what motivates him to pursue those cases. So whether you're a legal professional, maybe you're just a curious listener, or perhaps you're someone who's really passionate about justice, settle in because this conversation is going to promise to be insightful, nuanced, and also some straight talking conversation from one of the most distinctive voices in law today.
The Hearing.
Welcome to the podcast, Mark Stephens. Great to have your company. How are you this morning?
Very good. Thank you for having me.
Oh, it's a pleasure and it's lovely to see you again. We saw each other at some legal awards at a dinner. We were sitting next to each other and I found it a fascinating conversation. I thought you'd be a wonderful guest. So thank you so much for agreeing to do this. So you are a consultant at Howard Kennedy. Would you like to just tell our listeners what you specialise in? I'm sure some people have seen your name pop up, heard you on the radio, as I had years ago, seen you on various TV screens. So tell us what you specialise in firstly.
I suppose most people know me for media law, but actually I do quite a lot and have always done something which is where the law is changing. And as a consequence, I've done a very, very wide range of work. I started life as an intellectual property lawyer representing mainly artists and musicians, fine artists and musicians. But that led me to freedom of speech and through the copyright link, and then to the right to free speech, the sort of human rights stuff. And always I've been interested in where law can make or contribute to social change. So I've been very interested in the rights of unions. I've been very interested in more recent years decriminalising consenting adult gay love, because in so many countries homosexuality is criminalised, and of course gay lawyers can't bring cases to challenge, so it relies on allies. Similarly, I'm very, very interested in making a difference to people's lives. So every country has an age of consent to marriage, whether that's 16, there's a couple that are still 14, but essentially it's 16 or 18. And what we found is that there are a lot of people who are essentially sold into arranged marriages. And I read this story about a young Yemeni girl who at the age of 14 was sold into marriage to a 70-year-old man, and she died in childbirth the following year because her body hadn't developed sufficiently to carry a baby. And it was that kind of thing that I felt was an injustice, and unless I stepped in, nobody else seemed to be willing to do it. And so with a friend of mine who was then the Attorney General in India, I was really keen to take a case where essentially you ask social services or the police, or you get an order against them, to enforce the law on the age of marriage. And otherwise, what would happen is that the woman would run away from the abusive family she'd been sold into, and then the police or the social services would just return her because that was the cultural thing to do. She was somebody's property, essentially. And so I was very interested in how you could change that. And so took proceedings against social services and the police, requiring them to comply with the law. And that's revolved or caused some change over time. And they've now got places where women can go if they are in an abusive marriage which has been arranged for them, or indeed anything else. So it's those kinds of cases where things are changing or can change that have always inspired me. And at the end of my career, I find myself getting briefs where I'm asked to intercede in a case, to act as an amicus. And so I do maybe 3 or 4 cases in the European Court of Human Rights every year. Usually, the registrars find that the case has been brought by somebody who doesn't really understand the process of litigation in the European Court. They think there's a good point in there, but they want someone else to help tease that out for the court. And so often I'm given that opportunity. And of course, you can have a major impact with that. So it's about how you can have a good impact to see that things are changing. When the internet started, I was very interested in how do you prevent child abuse online. And so I was the founding chair of something called the Internet Watch Foundation, which was an organization to set up to eradicate paedophile images and paedophile information from the internet. And it's those kinds of issues where you can make an impact and have a real change that excite me. That's what gets me out of bed in the morning. And this morning I've been working on a human rights challenge to the Leasehold Reform Act, which was an act put forward in the sort of wash-up of the last government. It was hastily pushed through and appears to be failing on a number of human rights grounds. And so we're seeking to strike down that legislation as being not compliant with the Human Rights Act, even though a minister has signed a certificate of compliance. And of course, those are cases that don't happen every day of the week, but they are the things that really excite me.
Yeah, and I'm keen to find out about Mark Stephens, the man. What makes you tick? So where did this sense of, burning desire to eradicate injustice come from? What were some key experiences in your early life that made you think this is the path for me?
It's interesting, isn't it? I mean, I come from a very poor background. So my father was an artist. My mum was a homemaker, and we used to get free school meals because we were so poor. It was a very loving household, but it was unusual in the sense that my dad would paint an exhibition every 2 or 3 years, and we'd probably get 12 or 18 months money, and then we'd be back on the poverty line again. And so I think understanding how society can support people to contribute, I think is something which is in my DNA from that time. I remember I was riding on my moped when I was 16, and a policeman stopped me, and he said, "You just ran a red light," which I hadn't. And up until then, I'd always believed that policemen invariably told the truth. If you've got a problem, you ask a policeman, you support them. And it was a really salutary lesson to understand that policemen lied and lied on oath. And that sort of injustice sort of sparked in me something that was, I felt I needed to correct, and I didn't want it happening to anybody else. Then when I got to about, 17, 18, we'd got the manager of Pink Floyd as our lodger. At the time, the Floyd was still, just breaking big. They were away on tour a lot, so he wasn't around. And one morning I came down for breakfast, and my dad and Peter was sitting there chatting, and Peter said to me, "What do you want to do?" And I said, most 17-year-old boys, I said, "I want to go into the music industry like you." And he said, "Oh, I don't know about that." He said, "The lawyers make all the money. I'd go into the legal industry and then I'll give you all our work." Well, I did go into the legal industry, but I feel comprehensively tricked because, of course, he's a multi-millionaire living in idleness and luxury, and I'm human rights lawyer living in poverty in the East End. Well, relative poverty, first world problems. But it was that kind of thing where, I thought I was going to go and do something which was interesting to me. And I did start off doing copyright, as I said earlier, and part of that was the music thing, but actually I discovered that the people in the music industry were a bit entitled and not as pleasant as perhaps other areas, and I rather liked the artists, so that seemed to be a better place to go.
Yeah. So there's a few, you've done many high profile cases. I want to get into some of them, but before we do that, Mark, I just want to find out a little bit about you. What do you think is the one thing that most people don't know about you then?
I don't know. It's probably the sort of really foundational, visceral feelings for justice. And it's something which is right through my DNA in work, in life, in everything else. And I'm happy to go and advocate for a particular cause that I believe in, or where I think there's been an injustice, whether in personal life or in public life. And I think it's that feeling of a need to cause justice to occur is one of the things that's probably least seen. I suspect people see the public face of Mark Stephens, they hear me talking about cases, but they perhaps don't understand what the motivation is behind it. I think a lot of people think, oh, it's just him, he likes showing off on the telly and all the rest of it. And I try not to do it other than for a purpose, and it's to provide insights and perhaps views that otherwise haven't seen. So, for example, in the Johnny Depp case, it seemed to me that blaming Amber Heard, blaming the victim, was not attractive and not going to go down particularly well with the judge, Mr. Justice Nicol, who had, when he was at the bar, taken the seminal case which allowed the law to prosecute rape in marriage. Up until the 80s, no husband could be prosecuted for raping his wife because it was presumed as a matter of law that she would consent. And he overturned that rather anachronistic and archaic law. And it did seem to me that he'd done a lot of cases about abuse during his lifetime, and the sort of Darvo blaming the victim was not going to go down well with him. And I said I thought that Depp would lose. And at the time, that was completely counter to the sort of public narrative. And of course, after that happened, I got loads and loads of people calling saying, how on earth did you predict that? And I think it was because I'd looked at the case in more detail than just the sort of social media outputs that were coming around, which were very pro-Depp, looked to me to be orchestrated. I mean, I certainly got trolled by a lot of inauthentic accounts which were taken down literally in their hundreds by X. And so I did feel that there was something wrong with that case, and I also felt it was something of an injustice.
Yeah, and there were almost two trials going on, weren't there? Trial by media, what people saw on social media and the commentary around that and people's interpretation of what they saw. And, there was that going on, and then there was the actual trial. So it was fascinating how that played out and people, how they reacted to that.
It was a really interesting time, Yasmin, and I think one of the things is that if you've got the capacity to seed social media with particular narratives, with particular hashtags, like Amber Turd, for example, you are denigrating someone in the public eye. Now, I happen to know that Mr. Justice Nicol has never touched social media with a sterilised barge pole. So I knew that wasn't going to have an impact on him. And also, I think it was pretty ill judged, because I think, it was just a bad tactic. Of course, it wasn't a bad tactic in America when that second trial took place, because essentially the trial was televised and they clipped the televised parts. And so then everybody saw what they thought was the entire narrative of the case, but they didn't. They saw very specially, carefully curated and chosen parts. But I think it had a major impact on the jury, and you couldn't speak to people and say rationally, this is a case about whether Johnny Depp was abusive towards Amber Heard. It wasn't a question of whether she hit him. It wasn't a question of whether she'd had an affair. It wasn't a question of whether she was a gold digger. All themes that struck me were there to try and essentially distract from the essential question, did he hit her? And it seemed to me that was not the actions of an entirely innocent person.
And actually, interestingly, we've interviewed, one of the episodes in the podcast is we've interviewed Johnny Depp's, one of his lawyers. So listeners may want to refer back to that one. That's an interesting background. So let's get into the Julian Assange case very briefly. This one was huge, both legally and politically. Could you just remind listeners how you were involved in that case? What was it actually about?
So at the time, Julian was in Sweden, and people will remember that there were some accusations that came. He came to London to start to give details of the cables from the American embassies, which he had managed to access. And we now know with the aid of Chelsea Manning. And I think there was a sort of failing to understand that he'd really got a tiger by the tail in the sense of the US and how they worked against him. And he said to me, look, I'm happy to go to Switzerland, to Sweden to account for these matters, but I do feel the need to get the cables out. Can you deal with that? And I said, yes, there are 4 points here which are susceptible only to Court of Appeal in one case, and the other 3 only Supreme Court jurisprudence. So you've got plenty of time before you have to go back to Sweden. And I started those arguments and laid the foundation for them in the magistrates' court, in the original proceedings, in the interviews with the police. And as a consequence of that, we were able to develop those points, which ultimately came to be tried. But I think by the time that they came to be tried, it became such a political hot potato. I think people realized that this was a political case, not a legal case in the traditional sense. And so I think the case sort of took on dimensions of its own. And you're right. I mean, I don't think I've ever done a case as high profile. I've certainly done some high profile cases, but nothing that had that sort of global leverage, global interest, which was sort of unrelenting. But I did think it was an interesting case. It was an area of law which was moving. It was an area of law where, as I said, there was these novel points which I was interested to try and argue. I thought they had real merit, and I still think they have real merit in the sense that in a apolitical case they'd probably win. In a political case, it's going to be a little more difficult. And you know, I broke with him just before he went into the embassies, which was something he chose to do. And, you know, I've not been involved in it since then, but my assistant, Jennifer Robinson, has, and she ultimately negotiated his exit and was on the plane that took him to the furthest outpost of the US so that the matter could be dismissed. And then he went back to Australia, where he's living quietly with his family.
Yeah, and how did you deal with that media attention then at the time? You said it was probably one of the biggest global cases you've been involved with. What was there anything that surprised you about all the media attention, or?
I think no. I think when you're in it, you don't really understand it. But you also, you know, I mean, I've dealt with cases that are political. For example, Mrs. Thatcher deciding to shut down the mines in this country. A highly charged political matter at the time. I did the cases. There was lots of interest in it. But the sort of level of dirty tricks that you experience in it and the level of scrutiny that you experience was nothing like this. And I think that's partly because of the 24-hour news cycle now and also social media. And there were a lot of people who really disliked him. And anyone that was prepared to make an argument on his behalf, whether or not, they fell into that usual trap of identifying the lawyer who's doing an independent job with the interests of the client. I never aligned with the client. I always took the legal points, and I think people miss that as well. So you get a level of abuse as well. And indeed, it was quite interesting because I was doing some work at the time for Jimmy Wales and Wikipedia about them being blocked in some countries. And they put controls on Assange's page because it was getting vandalized every day. And they put editors in a team of editors in 3 different time zones. So one in Asia, one in Europe, one in America. In fact, there was more than one in each. There was a little team. And they got notified every time there was an amendment made to my page, and they would verify whether it was acceptable or not. And, you know, there were people that were trying to troll and other things, but, you know, it's the sort of personalized attacks that get pretty difficult. But behind all of that, I was convinced that the arguments that we had were good arguments that needed to be aired. And, you know, if you know that and you think that what you're doing is right and appropriate, then sometimes the criticism doesn't really land and the abuse doesn't land in quite the same way. And, you know, I think during my time of representing him, I think I did turn his reputation around. I think people did understand that there was more to this than met the eye. And I think that was an issue that went forward. And I think it was also interesting because I think Julian is on the spectrum, and he doesn't have the same emotional responses that ordinary folk without being on the spectrum have. And I was very fortunate that my godson was on the spectrum. I had friends who were on the spectrum. And so I understood how to manage that for him. So I remember saying to him, oh, there's somebody from Pink Floyd wants to come and visit you. Someone from Dire Straits wants to come and visit you. And he said, well, I think I've heard of Pink Floyd, but I've never heard of Dire Straits. And I said to his team, well, you better start playing him some music from these two so he knows a bit about it. And the same with a film director that was very famous who went to visit him. I said, you better watch some films. And when he did, and he focused on those things, he was really interesting. But he just, he's so hyper-focused on what he does, on his special skills. Sometimes the sort of social interactions are lost a bit in that. And I think that's something of the case which didn't really come out in the public domain. It started to, with the benefit of hindsight, but at the time it wasn't really in front and center or featuring at all.
That was fortunate. You had some personal experience. You knew how to communicate with him effectively.
Yeah, I mean, it wasn't about communication so much. It was about anticipating what he was going to need to deal with and asking him to think about those things. So everything that he did was his stuff. I wasn't putting words in his mouth or anything of that kind. It was, you're going to be meeting this person, think about what they might be interested in, what connections you have, what are your interests which overlap, the sort of things that most people take without a cue. I found that he responded better with a cue and when he had the chance to think about it. And he was very, very good at that. And he was very willing to think about things openly, which, one suggested to him. And I think that improved dialogues with people and improved understanding between him and other folk.
Interesting. And did working on that case change how you think about whistleblowers or digital rights or press freedom in general?
I think it did to some degree, because I felt that there was a very deliberative campaign to undermine him in the public's eye. And I think the information that he gave was essential. It was exposing war crimes that we're still wrestling with in Afghanistan, the collateral murder video, for example, but also, the extrajudicial killings of prisoners and such like, injured people, are now still coming out all these years later. So I think he was proven to be correct in what he did. I think the problem is that when you take on a state with as many vested interests as the United States and indeed here, it becomes a more challenging case. I experienced that when I was representing the media as interveners in the Binyan Mohammed case. There were arguments that needed to be put forward, which nobody seemed to be wanting to talk about or to have examined. And it became clear, I think, that the government had misled the court about what the arrangements were between two countries. And I brought evidence from the United States which flatly contradicted the government's own evidence. And I think that was a real turning point in the case. And it's actually, when you get to do these cases, understanding that often the evidence is more important than the legal submissions, because you need a foundation. And I think a lot of lawyers today, they move around with the law, but they're not thinking about what's the evidential basis that the judge or the tribunal is going to have to consider in this case. And so making your record is of vital importance, but I think it's been slightly subsumed into speciality and people doing only one particular area of the law. We're sort of getting a bit de-skilled in those kind of areas.
Yeah. And I would love to hear your thoughts later on what important qualities you think a solicitor should have. You've mentioned a couple there, but before we get into that, Mark, James Hewitt, you also represented him,
Yeah.
and the media was relentless then. How did you go about protecting his privacy from a legal point of view?
Well, James predates British privacy law, essentially, as do a lot of the cases around the royal family and, Princess Diana. So we remember the gym photo, which was exploitative and intrusive and wouldn't be allowed today. We think about Linda Joyce, Princess Anne's lady's maid, who was accused. We think of the hacked phone call between the now king and the now queen, where transcripts were played over premium rate numbers and laid out in transcripts in the newspapers. All of those things would not be allowed today. So we were in a sort of high-spirited era of communication where privacy was kind of off the table, and so it was more about practical help that one could give. So I took him out of the country down to the south of France and booked flights in my name. I went to quite a nice small hotel that wasn't well known. We shared a room because I could then book it in my name rather than his. And, we sit there in the bedroom and I fling open the windows and what do I see down by the pool but Max Clifford and Antonia de Sancha with a newspaper crew from The Sun doing a photo shoot. So I sort of hopped out of the frying pan into the fire. Luckily, they all left that afternoon and we were able to come out of our room after a while. But
was that by chance, or they
completely by chance.
Wow.
They didn't know we were there, and we didn't know
chances?
they were. Yeah, I know, it was just bonkers. But it was also interesting because one could take him to a place at that time where he wouldn't be given up, he wouldn't be seen, and then you could deal with the issues that arose as a matter of legality. But I do think, we've got these new privacy laws, and that I think has helped the more modern royals redress the balance, except insofar as they intrude upon their own privacy.
The hearing.
On the outside, you're a lawyer, calm and cool. But inside there's a passion to perform, a drive to be absolutely on your game. You prepare hour after hour, day after day in the pursuit of excellence, relying on superior resources, serious preparation, and total confidence. That's the advantage we give you. Be your best with Thomson Reuters Practical Law.
As allegiances are tested.
You're gambling with World War III.
And regimes fall.
Fighters and civilians continue to stream in from other parts of Syria.
No matter where the story is, Reuters World News podcast is there. We make sense of the news shaping our world and give you everything you need to know in a 10-minute podcast every weekday. I'm your host, Kim Vanell. Listen and follow wherever you get your podcasts.
Turning to your global legal work, you've done a lot of work defending media freedom as well around the world. What do you think is the biggest legal threat you see right now to journalists and free speech? We talk a lot about free speech these days. What's your view on those issues?
I think we're seeing a sort of rise of autocracy. We're seeing a rise of totalitarianism within states. We're seeing the importance of media now understood, and so often in the global majority you will find people allied to the government, if not the government itself, owning media, which then is supportive of an authoritarian regime. And I think we also are seeing a move towards killings, and that sort of started in the Philippines with it became cheaper to have a journalist killed than to employ a lawyer to sue for libel. So it was $250 to have a journalist killed, and it was about $168 an hour to have a lawyer sue them. So the economics dictated which way they went. And we have seen increasingly the targeting and the criminalization of journalists, as well as the extrajudicial killings. I was at the Truth Tellers Summit, which Tina Brown has in honor of her ex-husband, Sir Harold Evans, who was the famous Times editor who uncovered, for example, thalidomide and many other scandals, and supported by Durham University and Reuters. And I think that was a really important event, because we had 3 people on stage. All 3 of us had been targeted for assassination. Myself, Christoph Grosev, who is being persecuted by Vladimir Putin for exposing the Salisbury poisonings and the deaths of a Russian opposition activist, and Keelan Gallagher, who has been working for Jimmy Lai and has been targeted by the Chinese state. And I can't think that in any recent past you would have had a situation where both journalists and lawyers are being targeted. We saw on the BBC last week a programme about assassination hit squads from Iran targeting journalists at Iran International, BBC Persian and Deutsche Welle Farsi. That is a really upgrading of risk. And I think that is something which I'm finding really, really troubling. And, whilst it hasn't slowed me down, I can certainly understand how it would slow a lot of people down in wanting to represent them. And of course, it also means that there are countries you can't go to because of cases that you've taken. And the world of geopolitics is changing, and that's not an ideal situation. So I'm representing a CNN journalist who went into Russia, the Ukrainian occupied part of Russia, and is now being targeted by the FSB. It used to be the KGB. They've cunningly rebranded themselves, and they're taking actions to criminalize, and they're issued arrest warrants and that kind of thing. So there's a real change afoot for journalists who are having an impact. And I think for lawyers that are going to defend them, there's also going to be risk too. And I think that's not an ideal situation. And again, it's about, I think, identifying lawyers as not independent professionals, but as people who are enabling people who are critics of a regime to continue to be critics. And I think that's what they're trying to choke off. We've seen it in Turkey, where, if you represent media organizations or journalists who are opposed to the regime, then, they start off by getting professional disciplinary actions against them, and then they titrate up to criminalization of the lawyers. So for lawyers and journalists, I think the risks are really starting to uprate.
Yeah, it's frightening times, and language is changing as well. I've noticed this term activist lawyers, which has been bandied about for a couple of years now, where it's everything's political, isn't it? That there's not a separation, realizing that lawyers are following their clients' instructions and carrying out their professional duties. There's no activism involved there, but that doesn't help, I don't think.
No, I don't think it does. And I think, for myself, whenever I'm commissioning lawyers, I always try and get a lawyer, not an activist lawyer, because often the activist lawyer will tell you what they hope the law will be, not what it actually is. And they're often blinded to other issues, and so they get caught off guard. So very often, if I'm going to a country, I will want a lawyer who will give me a good legal analysis, but I'm not really interested in one who's party pro. And that's a mistake that a lot of people make. So I've seen that in, Hong Kong, in Singapore, where people have gone with opposition lawyers, Malaysia, and that was just a hopeless exercise because you already start, 3 sets down because you've employed a lawyer who is perceived to be antipathetic to the state, and the judges know that that lawyer is antipathetic to the state. You much prefer and much need your cases to be judged on their merits, not on who the legal representative is.
And talking about misconceptions about lawyers or the legal profession, do you think the public have a misconception of what lawyers do and what their job is?
Well, I think a lot of them think that we're fat cats. Yes. And I think a lot of them are falling for the sort of political narrative that we're activists. I think you may not like what the law is, and if you're a politician, it's your job to change the law. But if the law is a particular way, then you've got to expect us to take those points, whether you like them or not. And generally, I don't think the law is favouring one side or another. You obviously get cases which have political overtones or have wider impact on society. But ultimately, it's about doing justice for the individual. And if you can do that, then I think you've achieved something.
I would love to hear more about cases you're passionate about that you're working on. But before I get to that, Mark, thinking about lots of sort of up and coming lawyers listening to this podcast, wanting to be a solicitor, what do you think are some of the most important qualities they need to have? You touched on this earlier when we spoke, but can you think of any more?
Yeah, I mean, I think you have to have an independence of thought, and I think you need intellectual curiosity. And I think one of the challenges we have today is that, you specialize very, very early in your career. I never specialized that early. And as a consequence, I think I was able to take bits of law from, in one area of property, for example, another one in family law, and bring them together and mold them. And I think the best lawyers I see have that sort of intellectual curiosity. They're able to bring concepts and themes from different areas of law. But if you're blindfolded and blinkered to one specific area, you're not going to see what's happening in other areas. And for years, I used to read law journals cover to cover, not just my specialist areas. So I'd read about judicial review, and I'd read about all sorts of stuff, family law, and I'd read the law reports when they came in every week. In the old days, when they came in by paper, I would read them all, and I would look for interesting things that were happening. I think that that opportunity isn't really there anymore, because you're invited to subscribe to specialist areas. And of course, that's important. You need to be skilled in your specialist areas, but I think you need to know what's happening at the broadest level. And so I think I would say, make sure you read all the decisions that are coming out of the European Court of Human Rights, the Inter-American, and as well as the Court of Appeal on judicial reviews, or the House of Law, or the Supreme Court on all of their cases. I think when you start seeing what's happening in those sort of environments, and perhaps even in international law, what are the principles of international law that are developing, that will give you insights on how the law is changing, why it's changing. And, the law has always evolved. The idea that it's something static, or that, I used to have a partner who used to tease me. He said, Mark, we always think that you've failed dismally if you win at first instance. We expect you to lose until you get to the Supreme Court or at least the European Court of Human Rights. And there was some truth in that because, the orthodoxy is all that you will get from a first instance judge. And that's what their job is, to promote and promulgate the orthodoxy. But if you're interested in moving the law and changing it, and all of those lawyers that you see as judges in the Court of Appeal or higher are interested in the interaction between public policy and the law, and how law can better reflect and do justice within the society that they're finding themselves in. And I think we're going to see an explosion of cases around business and human rights. We're going, along with the UN guiding principles on business and human rights, which are entrenching into international law, and that means they're part of UK national law or laws. And I also think we're going to see a lot more about the environment. And, there will be hiccups along the way, but I think those are the sorts of cases that we're going to see for the future. And it's going to need creative lawyering in order to make those advances in the law.
That's really fantastic advice. And I think it's a sign of our times that the algorithm means that we will be just looking at things that maybe interest us, but we're not necessarily expanding our knowledge and being challenged by other viewpoints or different areas of law that we may not specialize in. But actually, it provides you with good knowledge and being an all-rounded lawyer with interest in different things and knowing what's going on in the world. So that's really good advice.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think the algorithms also are designed to create an echo chamber of things that you're used to hearing.
Totally.
And I think we have to hear the dissonant voices. We have to hear the alternative opinions in order to make up our minds on the issues of the day. And I suspect that we are being too blinkered in what it is that we're considering.
Yeah. I mean, if I was thinking about this the other day, if someone saw my podcast list, they actually couldn't guess politically who I vote for, what I'm necessarily interested in, because I listen to such a range of things, left, right, centre, right, that actually people would be quite surprised. But I don't know if that's typical. I think if you look at most people's lists of podcasts they listen to, you probably could get a fair idea of how they vote, what they think. I don't know.
I think you're absolutely right. I mean, I listened to GB News a bit when it first started, and I thought it was really interesting because they were clearly speaking to an unmet or unfed part of the population. And, to hear that they were eclipsing Sky News in bulletins in terms of viewership and BBC and Sums, and they were hitting a sort of white demographic of Lidl and Tesco shoppers that in a way which other channels weren't, was said that there's a group of people here who feel disenfranchised. And you need to understand why they feel disenfranchised. You're not necessarily approving of the messages that are going out, but I think understanding why people are feeling alienated and not heard is a really important part of contributing to the development of society.
Nothing wrong with Lidl, Mark. Nothing wrong with Lidl or Tesco's. But no, they were filling a void, definitely filling a void. And so we need to understand where is this coming from? What, not just listen to our own, in inverted commas, platforms that we're probably more comfortable with, or generally people are. So I absolutely agree.
Yeah, and I think there's a lot of virtue signaling around it. So when I told people I was listening to GB News, they looked at me absolutely horrified that I would even consider it. And I just said, well, what are you getting by, reading The Guardian and watching the BBC? You're not being stretched.
Well, I agree. I spoke to a good friend of mine who I would describe as very left. And I said, look, I'm actually listening to Joe Rogan. He did interview Donald Trump, and I'm quite fascinated. I think he's got the biggest podcast. And she said, I won't listen to him because I know exactly what he stands for. He's completely against my values, and I won't even listen So I thought, well, this is why we're in the mess that we're in the first place, with each side are not listening to each other.
Yeah, it's absolutely right. It's become tribal. And
Totally.
unless you understand what's motivating and causing the other tribe to behave in the way they are, there's no chance of rapprochement or being able to bridge that divide. And that sort of continuum that we used to have of political discourse where, people in the middle kind of clustered around, but there were people at either ends of the spectrum. That middle seems to have been denigrated and eroded to a point of non-existence. And I think that is a real challenge for society. And, I see clients, so I'm prepared to take cases on to represent organizations and people where they want to improve their human rights record. And I think you have to take on the bad actors in order to help them to a better place. Because if you don't do that, then they're never going to get there. But there's a lot of people out there who are sort of virtue signaling, well, I'd never represent that particular client. I'd never represent a tobacco company, or I'd never represent, a Chinese company where slave labor had been used. If you don't, you're never going to have an impact. You're never going to improve things. And I saw how change could be visited during the Qatar World Cup. When they cleaned house and they brought in the new team led by Hassan Al-Tuadi, who's an amazing, insightful leader, they gave human rights. They legislated for human rights for itinerant workers, which no other state in the Gulf had done and has done. And that meant that they had rights. So when a worker comes in, they get given $2,000 or $5,000 as a signing on bonus, because that will pay back the loan that they had to take out at home to pay the gangmasters where they were recruited in Nepal or wherever it happened to be. And unless you can actually start to get change in those kinds of places, then I think we've got long-term problems. So we have to look at continuous improvement over time. We're not going to get some magical solution where it's all perfect. And I think that's really important. I mean, if you think about gay folk going to Qatar, not one gay couple or any gay person was troubled during the World Cup. And that was because they made a decision that although it's a criminal offence in Qatar, their obligations as Arabs of hospitality trumped any distaste, as they put it, for homosexuality. And so it was a very welcoming, open and inclusive games, despite the law, which, we'd all like them to reject. But just at this particular point in time, it's not possible and not practical. But they did take down, couples from all of the major European so the LGBTQ plus supporters clubs, the male and female couples were taken down on orientation in advance to show that it was safe and welcoming. And I thought that was an amazing advance. There's nowhere else in the Middle East that's happening. No. You're certainly not seeing it happen in Saudi, where they've got the World Cup in 2030.
I mean, that is fascinating. And to challenge the system, you have to sometimes work within the system, which is sometimes very uncomfortable for people. Mark, I could talk to you all day, but I think we should wrap up by asking you really if there's anything else you'd like to mention. Any plans to appear on GB News?
I think my GB News days are over.
You have been on GB News.
Oh yeah, I have been on GB News. I mean, I was often asked to put the lefty view, which I, always happy to do. I think you need to introduce alternative narratives to folk who perhaps won't have heard those narratives or don't think much of them. But it's important that they hear them, because as long as we sit in our sort of tribal divides, and we're just reinforcing with the echo chamber of our own ideas, we're never going to be challenged. We're never going to move on. And so it's that communication across the divide that's very important to me.
Yeah. Is that your final thought, or is there anything else you'd like to say?
No, I think that's it.
That's it.
I've really enjoyed it. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
The Hearing.
Thank you for listening, and please do provide your feedback via thehearing@tr.com, and don't forget to like and follow us.
The Hearing, a legal podcast from Thomson Reuters. To find out more, go to tr.com/The Hearing or subscribe via iTunes, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts.